What if everything you learned in school wasn't a lie, but also wasn't the full truth? What if the version of history you were taught wasn't incorrect, just incomplete in a way that quietly changes everything? Because the most dangerous kind of truth isn't the one that's hidden. It's the one that's right in front of you, carefully edited, so you never question what's missing. For generations, history has been presented as a collection of facts, dates, names, outcomes, organized neatly into chapters that feel complete. But completeness can be an illusion, because history isn't just about what happened. It's about what gets recorded, what gets repeated, and more importantly, what gets left out. From the moment we first open a textbook, we're introduced to a version of the past that feels structured and certain. Events follow a logical order. Causes lead to effects. Decisions make sense. And everything seems to move forward in a way that feels understandable. But real history doesn't work like that. Real history is messy, complicated, full of contradictions, hidden motives, and decisions made in moments that were never meant to be remembered. And yet, what we're taught rarely reflects that complexity. Instead, we're given simplified narratives, clean versions of events that remove confusion, reduce conflict, and present outcomes as inevitable. But when something becomes too clean, too perfect, it raises a question. What had to be removed to make it look that way? Because the truth is, history is written by people. And people have perspectives, biases, agendas. Not always obvious, not always intentional, but always present. Every decision about what to include, what to emphasize, and what to ignore shapes the story that gets passed down. And over time, those decisions become invisible. They blend into the narrative so completely that we stop noticing them. We stop asking what might be missing. We stop questioning whether the story we're hearing is the whole story at all. Think about how history is taught. You learn about major events, wars, revolutions, discoveries. You're told what happened, when it happened, and who was involved. But rarely are you told why certain details were chosen over others. Why some voices are highlighted while others are barely mentioned. Why certain moments are described in depth while others are reduced to a single sentence. Because those choices matter. They shape how we understand the past. And once that understanding is formed, it becomes very difficult to see beyond it. There are events in history that seem straightforward until you look a little closer. Details that don't quite fit. Timelines that raise questions. Decisions that feel too convenient. But in most cases, those inconsistencies are ignored. Not because they don't exist, but because they complicate the narrative. And complicated narratives are harder to teach, harder to control, harder to accept. So instead, they're simplified, edited, reshaped into something that feels complete, even when it isn't. And this isn't about conspiracy. It's not about secret organizations hiding entire chapters of history from the world. It's something much quieter than that, much more subtle. It's about selection, about emphasis, about the natural human tendency to organize information in a way that makes sense, even if that means leaving certain parts behind. Over time, those omissions add up. They create gaps. And those gaps are where the real story often exists. Because sometimes, what's missing from history is more important than what's included. There are moments, small, almost invisible moments, that change the course of events in ways that aren't immediately obvious. Decisions made in private. Conversations that were never recorded. Actions that didn't make it into official accounts. These moments don't always disappear completely. Traces of them remain, hidden in letters, buried in archives, referenced indirectly in other records. But they're rarely part of the main narrative. They exist on the edges, easy to overlook, easy to ignore. And yet, when those fragments are put together, they tell a different story. A story that doesn't always align with what we were taught. A story that raises uncomfortable questions. Because if one part of history can be incomplete, then how many others are the same? And that's where the unease begins. Not in the idea that history is wrong, but in the realization that it might not be fully right. Because once you start to see the gaps, you can't unsee them. You begin to notice patterns. Similar structures in different events. The same types of details being emphasized. The same kinds of information being left out. And slowly, a different understanding starts to form. One that isn't based on a single narrative, but on the recognition that narratives themselves can be shaped. And shaping doesn't always require deception. Sometimes it just requires silence. There are stories that never make it into textbooks. Not because they aren't important, but because they don't fit neatly into the version of history that's being told. Stories that complicate the narrative, that challenge the idea of clear heroes and clear villains, that reveal motivations that are harder to accept. These stories don't disappear completely. They exist in the background, waiting to be noticed. But most people never look for them because they don't realize they're missing. And that's the key. You don't question what you don't know is there, which means the most effective way to shape history isn't to change it. It's to decide which parts people will never see. Over time, those unseen parts become forgotten, not erased, just disconnected from the main story. And once that happens, the narrative becomes stable, consistent, easy to teach, easy to understand, but also incomplete. And incompleteness has consequences, because the way we understand the past shapes how we see the present. It influences our decisions, our beliefs, our assumptions about how the world works. And if that understanding is based on a version of history that's been simplified, then our view of reality is simplified too. We begin to accept things as inevitable, that were actually the result of complex choices. We see outcomes as natural when they were carefully constructed. We believe in clear narratives when the truth was anything but clear. And that's why this matters. Because history isn't just about the past. It's about perspective. And perspective can be guided carefully, quietly, over time. There's a reason certain questions aren't asked in classrooms. Not because they're forbidden, but because they're never introduced. And if a question is never asked, the answer never becomes relevant. It remains hidden, not by force, but by absence. And that kind of absence is powerful, because it doesn't feel like something is missing. It feels like everything is already there. Until you start to look closer. Until you start to notice the edges of the narrative. The points where things feel too simple, too clean, too complete. And that's when the realization begins to settle in. Not all at once, but slowly. That what you were taught wasn't wrong. It was just incomplete. And once you accept that possibility, everything changes. Because if one story can be incomplete, then every story can be questioned, every event re-examined, every detail reconsidered. And that doesn't make history less reliable. It makes it more real, more complex, more human, but also more unsettling. Because real history doesn't always provide comfort. It doesn't always offer clear answers. Sometimes it just leaves you with better questions. And those questions are where the truth begins. But the first secret isn't something completely unknown. It's something you've heard before, just not in the way it actually happened. And once you see what was left out, you'll never look at it the same way again. There are some moments in history that feel so familiar, so widely accepted, that questioning them almost feels unnecessary. Events that are taught early, repeated often, and remembered in a way that feels complete. But familiarity can be deceptive, because the more something is repeated, the less we tend to examine it. And that's exactly where the first hidden layer begins. You've heard the story before. A turning point. A moment that changed everything. Presented as a clear sequence of cause and effect, where one decision led directly to another, and history moved forward in a way that felt almost inevitable. It's the kind of story that fits perfectly into a textbook. Easy to follow, easy to remember, easy to accept. But what if that version of the story was only part of what actually happened? Because when you look beyond the surface, beyond the simplified narrative, you start to notice something unusual. Details that don't quite align. Actions that seem out of place. Decisions that feel too precise, too calculated, to be purely reactive. And once you start connecting those details, a different picture begins to form. Not one of randomness, but of intention. Because the official version of events often focuses on what was visible. The moments that were recorded, witnessed, and later written down. But history isn't only shaped by what's visible. It's shaped by what happens behind the scenes, in places where decisions are made long before the outcome becomes public. And in this case, those hidden decisions may have mattered more than the event itself. At the time, everything appeared to unfold quickly. A sudden shift. A reaction to a situation that escalated beyond control. That's how it's usually described. But when you examine the timeline more closely, the speed begins to feel unusual. Not rushed, but prepared. because true unpredictability leaves traces of confusion, disorder, inconsistency. But this event feels structured, like something that followed a path that already existed. And that raises a question that most people never consider. Was it really as unexpected as it seemed? Or was it the visible result of something that had already been set in motion? Because events of that scale don't happen in isolation. They are built on layers of decisions, conversations, and influences that rarely make it into the final version of the story. And when those layers are removed, what's left feels simpler than it actually was. But simplicity can hide complexity. And complexity is where the truth often lives. There were individuals involved whose roles were clearly defined. Leaders who made decisions. Figures who became central to the narrative. Their actions are documented, analyzed, and remembered. But surrounding them were others. Less visible, less discussed. Individuals whose influence didn't come from public action, but from private involvement. These are the people who don't appear in most textbooks. Not because they weren't important, but because their presence complicates the story. Because once you acknowledge them, the narrative changes. It becomes less about a single moment and more about a process. Less about reaction and more about preparation. And that shift is significant. Because preparation implies foresight. It suggests that what happened wasn't entirely spontaneous. That certain outcomes may have been anticipated or even guided. And that's where the discomfort begins. Because if an event that feels sudden was actually influenced by prior decisions, then the version of history we're familiar with is missing something important. There are records, scattered, incomplete, often overlooked, that hint at this deeper layer. References to meetings that weren't widely documented. Communications that don't fully align with the official timeline. Actions taken quietly, without immediate explanation. Individually, these details don't seem significant. But together, they create a pattern. A pattern that suggests coordination. Not in an obvious, dramatic sense, but in a subtle, controlled way. The kind that doesn't draw attention in the moment, but becomes visible only when you look back. And that's exactly what makes it so difficult to recognize. Because by the time the full picture begins to form, the narrative has already been established. The simplified version has already been taught, accepted, repeated. And once a narrative becomes widely accepted, challenging it becomes increasingly difficult. Not because it's impossible, but because it requires people to reconsider something they've always believed to be complete. And most people don't revisit what they think they already understand, which is why these hidden layers remain hidden. Not through secrecy, but through familiarity. Because when something feels known, it stops being questioned. But here's the part that changes everything. When historians and researchers, those who look beyond the surface, begin to piece together these overlooked details, they don't always arrive at a single alternative explanation. Instead, they uncover something more complex. Multiple possibilities, different interpretations, conflicting perspectives. And that might seem like uncertainty, but in reality, it's closer to the truth. Because real events, especially those that shape history, are rarely simple enough to fit into a single, clean narrative. They involve competing interests, hidden motivations, decisions made under pressure, and sometimes long before the pressure becomes visible. And once you accept that complexity, the original version of the story starts to feel incomplete. Not incorrect, just limited, because it shows you what happened, but not everything that led to it. And that distinction matters, because understanding an outcome without understanding its full context can change how you interpret it, how you learn from it, and how you apply it to the present. Which brings us to something even more unsettling. If this event, something so widely known, so deeply embedded in education, can have layers that are rarely discussed, then what about other events? How many of them follow the same pattern? How many have details that were simplified, reduced, or left out entirely? And more importantly, why? Because omission doesn't always require intent. Sometimes it's the result of practicality, the need to simplify, to make complex ideas easier to teach. But sometimes, omission serves another purpose. It keeps the narrative stable, predictable, easier to accept, and stability can be valuable, especially when the alternative is complexity that raises more questions than answers. But those questions are exactly where understanding begins. Because once you realize that a familiar story can contain unfamiliar layers, you start to look at everything differently. You begin to question not just what you were taught, but how it was presented, what was emphasized, what was minimized, what was left out. And slowly, the idea of history as a fixed, complete record starts to shift into something more flexible, more layered, more real, but also more uncertain. Because uncertainty means you don't have all the answers, and not having all the answers can be uncomfortable, but it's also honest, because the truth isn't always clean. It isn't always easy to explain, and it doesn't always fit into the structure we expect. Sometimes, it exists in fragments, in details that don't immediately connect, in questions that don't have simple answers. And that's exactly what this first secret reveals. Not a hidden fact, not a single missing piece, but a realization that even the most familiar stories may not be as complete as they seem. But if one of the most well-known events in history can have layers that were quietly simplified, then the next secret goes even further. Because this time, it's not just about what was changed, it's about who was completely erased, and why no one ever noticed. History has a way of remembering names, but it also has a way of forgetting them. And sometimes, the difference between being remembered and being erased has nothing to do with what someone did. It has everything to do with who tells the story. Because when we look back at the past, we tend to see it through a narrow lens. A collection of key figures, leaders, heroes, individuals whose names appear again and again in textbooks, documentaries, and conversations. Their actions are highlighted, their decisions analyzed, their legacies preserved, and over time, they become symbols of entire movements, entire eras, entire transformations. But no movement, no discovery, no major shift in history is ever the result of a single person. Behind every well-known name, there are others. People who contributed just as much, sometimes more, but whose stories were never fully told. And the unsettling part isn't that they were forgotten. It's that many of them were never included to begin with. Because inclusion in history isn't automatic. It's selective, and selection creates narrative. There are countless examples. Individuals who played critical roles in shaping events, whose contributions were essential, whose actions influenced outcomes in ways that cannot be ignored, and yet, their names rarely appear in the version of history most people know. At first, this might seem like an oversight, a gap in documentation, a simple case of information being lost over time. But when you begin to notice how often this happens, how consistently certain types of people are left out, it stops feeling accidental. It starts to feel like a pattern. Because the people who are remembered often share something in common. They fit the narrative. They represent the story in a way that is easy to understand, easy to teach, easy to repeat. But the people who don't fit that structure, the ones whose presence complicates the narrative, are often pushed to the edges, reduced to footnotes, or removed entirely. And once that happens, their absence becomes invisible, because you can't miss what you were never shown. There are individuals whose ideas laid the foundation for discoveries that would later be credited to others. People who worked behind the scenes, writing, calculating, designing, organizing, whose efforts made progress possible, but whose names were never attached to the final outcome. And over time, the credit shifted. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but gradually, until the original contributors were no longer part of a story at all. And this isn't just about recognition. It's about understanding. Because when you remove certain people from history, you don't just erase their names. You erase the full context of how things actually happened. You simplify complex processes into singular achievements. You turn collective effort into individual success. And that changes how we interpret the past. It creates the illusion that history moves forward through isolated moments of brilliance, rather than through collaboration, struggle, and often unseen effort. But the truth is rarely that simple. There are stories buried in archives, letters, journals, documents, that reveal a very different version of events. Accounts that show multiple voices involved in decisions that were later attributed to one. Evidence of contributions that were acknowledged at the time, but gradually faded from the narrative as it was retold. And the most disturbing part is how easily that fading can happen. Because history isn't rewritten all at once. It changes slowly. With each retelling, each summary, each simplification, details are condensed, names are reduced, focus shifts, until eventually, what remains is a version of the story that feels complete, even though it isn't. And the people who were once part of it disappear. Not physically, but historically. Which raises a question that is difficult to ignore. How many of the names we recognize today represent more than just themselves? How many stand in place of others whose contributions were never fully acknowledged? And more importantly, why? Because forgetting isn't always neutral. Sometimes it serves a purpose. There are moments in history where acknowledging every contributor would complicate the narrative in ways that are difficult to manage. It might challenge existing power structures. It might shift the focus away from certain figures. It might introduce perspectives that don't align with the version of events that has already been accepted. And when that happens, simplification becomes a choice. A way to maintain clarity, consistency, control. But control over narrative comes at a cost. Because when you control who is remembered, you also control how history is understood. You influence which qualities are celebrated, which actions are valued, which perspectives are considered important, and which ones are ignored. And over time, that influence shapes more than just our understanding of the past. It shapes our expectations of the present. We begin to look for the same patterns, the same types of individuals, the same kinds of stories, because that's what we've been taught to recognize. But what if those patterns are incomplete? What if the real story of progress, of change, of transformation is far more complex than what we've been shown? Because when you start to uncover the people who were left out, you begin to see a different version of history, one that is less centered on individuals and more focused on systems, processes, networks of influence. And that version is harder to simplify, harder to teach, harder to fit into a structured narrative. But it's also closer to the truth. There are cases where entire groups were excluded from historical recognition. Not just individuals, but communities whose contributions were essential to the development of events, technologies, and ideas that shaped the world. Their work was real, their impact measurable, but their presence in the narrative minimal. And that kind of exclusion doesn't happen without reason, because including them would change the story. It would require a different perspective, a broader understanding, a willingness to accept that history is not as straightforward as it appears. And that can be uncomfortable, because complexity challenges certainty. It forces us to reconsider what we thought we knew, to question assumptions that felt stable, and to accept that the past may not be as clear as we believed. But that discomfort is part of understanding, because the truth isn't always found in the most visible places. Sometimes it exists in the margins, in the names that aren't mentioned, in the stories that aren't told, in the gaps between what is known and what is missing. And once you start to look in those gaps, you realize something important. History doesn't just forget people. It chooses what to remember. And that choice shapes everything. Because the people we remember become symbols, examples, representations of how change happens. But if those representations are incomplete, then our understanding of change is incomplete too. We begin to believe that progress comes from singular figures rather than collective effort. That impact requires recognition rather than contribution. That being remembered is the same as being important, when in reality, some of the most important people in history are the ones whose names we never learned. And that realization changes the way we see everything, because it means the story isn't finished. It's still being uncovered, still being questioned, still being expanded. And that process is ongoing, because every time a forgotten name is rediscovered, every time a hidden contribution is brought back into the narrative, history becomes a little more complete, a little more accurate, a little more real. But it also becomes more complicated, more uncertain, and more difficult to simplify. And that brings us to the most unsettling part of this entire idea. If people can be removed from history so quietly, so completely, that generations grow up without ever knowing they existed, then what else has been left out? What other contributions, decisions, influences are missing from the stories we've been told? And how would those stories change if those missing pieces were restored? Because once you begin to question who was forgotten, you inevitably begin to question who was remembered, and why. But if history has the power to erase people, to remove entire contributions from the story without most people ever noticing, then the next secret goes even deeper, because this time, it's not about who was forgotten. It's about a decision that was never meant to be seen, and the impact it still has today. Some moments in history don't look important until it's too late. They don't arrive with noise. They don't announce themselves. They don't feel like turning points. Instead, they happen quietly, behind closed doors, in rooms that never appear in textbooks, in conversations that are never fully recorded. And yet those are often the moments that change everything, because not all decisions are made in public. In fact, the ones that matter most rarely are. There's a tendency to believe that major historical shifts are the result of visible events, wars, revolutions, discoveries, moments that can be pointed to, analyzed, and clearly identified as the cause of change. But what if those visible moments are only the outcome? What if the real turning point happened earlier, in a place where no one was watching? Because before every major event, there are decisions, choices that shape the direction things will take. And sometimes, those choices are made in ways that were never meant to be seen. This particular decision didn't come with immediate consequences. There was no instant reaction, no public acknowledgement. At the time, it passed quietly, almost unnoticed. But over time, its impact began to spread, slowly, subtly, in ways that weren't immediately connected back to the moment it was made. And that's what made it so powerful. Because the most effective decisions aren't the ones that create immediate change. They're the ones that reshape the conditions under which future events unfold. This decision did exactly that. It didn't force an outcome. It guided one. It created a framework, a structure within which certain possibilities became more likely, and others became almost impossible. And once that framework was in place, everything that followed began to align with it. Not perfectly, not predictably, but consistently enough that, over time, the pattern became clear. But only in hindsight, because in the moment, it didn't look like a defining choice. It looked like something minor, something administrative, something that didn't require public attention. And that's what allowed it to remain unnoticed. Because people tend to focus on what feels significant and ignore what feels routine. But routine actions can carry extraordinary consequences, especially when they are part of a larger strategy. There are records, partial, fragmented, that hint at this decision. References in documents that were never widely circulated. Mentions in communications that don't provide full context. Enough to confirm that something happened, but not enough to explain it completely. And that lack of clarity is not accidental. Because full transparency would have revealed too much that IT would have connected the decision to outcomes that were not yet visible. It would have exposed the level of foresight involved. And foresight implies intention, which raises a difficult question. Was the outcome truly a result of circumstance? Or was it shaped long before it appeared to happen? Because when you begin to trace the effects of this decision, you start to see how deeply it influenced what came after. Policies that followed a certain direction, actions that aligned with a specific pattern, outcomes that, on the surface, seemed unrelated, but shared a common thread. And that thread leads back to that original moment, that quiet decision, made without attention, without scrutiny, without immediate consequence, but with long-term impact that extended far beyond what anyone could see at the time. And this is where the narrative becomes difficult, because acknowledging this kind of influence changes how we understand history. It shifts the focus away from visible events and toward invisible processes. It suggests that what we see as spontaneous may actually be structured, that what we interpret as reaction may be part of a plan. And that idea is uncomfortable, because it challenges the belief that history unfolds naturally, that events happen as a result of clear, visible causes, that outcomes are the product of immediate circumstances. But when hidden decisions are involved, that clarity begins to fade, because now you have to consider the possibility that some outcomes were shaped in advance, not in a way that guarantees a specific result, but in a way that makes certain results more likely than others. And that kind of influence is difficult to detect, because it doesn't appear as control. It appears as coincidence, as natural progression, as something that just happened. But when you look closely, the consistency becomes harder to ignore, because coincidences don't usually follow patterns, but influenced outcomes do. And that's what makes this decision so significant. Not because of what it was, but because of what it did. Because once it was made, it set something in motion, something that didn't need to be constantly managed, something that could operate within the system it created. And over time, that system became part of reality, accepted, normalized, no longer questioned, because by then, it no longer looked like a decision. It looked like the way things had always been. And that transformation, from choice to norm, is one of the most powerful shifts in history. Because once something becomes normalized, it stops being examined. It becomes part of the background, something people live with without thinking about how it started. And that's exactly what happened here. The original decision disappeared, not erased, just disconnected from its consequences. And once that connection was lost, the impact continued, without resistance, without awareness, and without recognition. Which brings us to the present, because the effects of that decision didn't end in the past. They continued. They evolved. They adapted to new circumstances. But the underlying structure remained the same. And that means something important. Whatever was set in motion back then is still influencing things now. Not in an obvious way. Not in a way that can be easily pointed out, but in the patterns, the tendencies, the directions that events seem to follow. And that realization changes everything. Because now, history isn't just something that happened. It's something that is still happening, still unfolding, still shaped by choices that were made long ago, in places no one was watching, which raises the most unsettling question of all. If one quiet decision could have such a lasting impact, how many others are there? How many moments went unnoticed, but changed the direction of everything that followed? And how many of those influences are still active today? Because once you accept that possibility, the line between past and present begins to blur, and history stops being something distant, something fixed, something finished. It becomes something alive, something that continues to shape reality in ways that are not always visible. And that realization is what makes this secret so difficult to ignore, because it's not just about what happened. It's about what's still happening, and whether we're aware of it or not. But if a single hidden decision could reshape the future in ways that are still unfolding today, then the final secret goes even further, because this time, it's not just about the past influencing the present. It's about something that never actually ended and is still affecting the world right now. Some parts of history don't stay in the past. They don't fade. They don't become distant memories. They continue, quietly, shaping the present in ways that most people never notice. And that's what makes this final secret different. Because this isn't about something that happened and ended. This is about something that never really stopped. When we think about history, we imagine it as something complete. A series of events that began, unfolded, and eventually concluded. Something we can study, understand, and then leave behind. But that idea only works if every event truly has an ending. And not all of them do. Some decisions don't just influence what comes next. They create systems, structures, ways of thinking that become so deeply embedded in everyday life that they stop being recognized as part of history at all. They become normal, expected, invisible. And once something becomes invisible, it becomes incredibly difficult to question, because you don't examine what feels natural. You don't challenge what appears to have always existed. But what if some of those normal things aren't as natural as they seem? What if they are the result of choices made long ago, choices that were never fully explained, never fully understood, but continued to shape everything that followed? Because that's how lasting influence works. It doesn't rely on constant control. It relies on continuity, on the ability to sustain itself long after the original decision has been forgotten. And that continuity is what makes the secret so unsettling. Because when you begin to trace certain patterns in the present, patterns in how systems operate, how information is presented, how decisions are justified, you start to notice something familiar. Not identical, but consistent. A structure that feels inherited, as if it didn't begin here, but was carried forward from somewhere else. And that raises a possibility that is difficult to ignore. What if some of the systems we live within today are built on foundations that were never fully revealed? Because every system has an origin, a moment where it was created, defined, and set into motion. But not all origins are visible. Not all are documented in a way that makes them easy to understand. And when those origins are unclear, the system itself becomes harder to question, because without knowing how something began, you can't fully understand why it exists the way it does. And that lack of understanding creates acceptance, quiet, automatic acceptance. There are patterns in the way information is structured today, the way certain narratives are prioritized, the way some perspectives are emphasized while others are minimized. And while this can often be explained by practical reasons, clarity, efficiency, accessibility, those explanations don't always account for the consistency of the pattern. Because when something happens occasionally, it feels incidental. But when it happens repeatedly, across different contexts, over long periods of time, it starts to feel intentional. And that's where this final secret begins to take shape. Not as a single hidden fact, not as a specific event, but as a realization. That influence doesn't always end when an event does. Sometimes, it evolves, it adapts, it becomes part of a system itself. And once it reaches that stage, it no longer needs to be hidden, because it's no longer visible. It exists in the background, in the assumptions people make, in the frameworks that guide decisions, in the boundaries of what is considered normal and what is not. And those boundaries are powerful, because they define what people are willing to question, and what they accept without hesitation. But here's the unsettling part. When you begin to step outside those boundaries, even slightly, even just enough to observe them from a different angle, they start to look less stable, less fixed, more like structures that were built rather than natural conditions that always existed. And that realization changes everything. Because if something was built, it can be understood. And if it can be understood, it can be questioned. But questioning something that feels normal is difficult, because it requires you to separate what is familiar from what is true. And that separation isn't always clear, because familiarity creates comfort, and comfort discourages doubt. But doubt is where awareness begins. There are moments, small, almost unnoticeable, where this hidden continuity becomes visible, not in a dramatic way, not as a clear revelation, but as a subtle recognition, a sense that something doesn't quite align, that the explanation being given doesn't fully account for what you're seeing. And most of the time, that feeling is ignored, not because it's wrong, but because it's inconvenient. It complicates things. It introduces uncertainty. And uncertainty is something people naturally try to avoid. But when enough of those moments begin to connect, when those small inconsistencies start to form a pattern, it becomes harder to ignore. Because patterns suggest structure, and structure suggests design, which leads to a question that is both simple and deeply unsettling. How much of what we accept today is shaped by decisions we were never aware of? Because if the past has the ability to influence the present in ways that remain hidden, then the present itself becomes more complex, less predictable, less certain. And that uncertainty changes how we see everything. It challenges the idea that we are fully aware of the systems we live within. It suggests that there are layers, historical, structural, conceptual, that continue to operate beneath the surface, not controlling every outcome, but influencing direction, guiding possibilities, shaping the range of what seems normal and what doesn't. And once you begin to see those layers, you can't unsee them, because they don't disappear. They remain quiet, consistent, present, which means this final secret isn't something that can be fully revealed, because it's not a single piece of information. It's a perspective, a way of looking at the world that acknowledges the possibility that not everything we accept is as complete as it appears, that some systems may have origins that were never fully explained, that some patterns may exist because they were designed to continue, and that some influences may still be active, even now, not in obvious ways, not in ways that can be easily pointed out, but in the subtle consistency of how things unfold. And that realization is what makes this the most difficult truth to ignore, because it doesn't just change how you see the past, it changes how you see the present. And once that shift happens, everything feels different, more layered, more complex, more uncertain, but also more real. Because reality isn't always simple. It isn't always clear. And it isn't always fully visible. Sometimes, it exists just beneath the surface, waiting to be noticed. Because if history can quietly shape the systems we live within long after the original events have been forgotten, then the real question isn't what we were taught, it's what we're still living through, without even realizing it. In the end, history isn't just a record of the past. It's a version of the past. A version that has been shaped, organized, and simplified over time, until it feels complete. But as you've seen, completeness can be an illusion, because what we remember is only part of what actually happened. Some events were never what they seemed. Some people were never given the place they deserved. Some decisions were made quietly, far away from public view, and yet their impact spread across decades, even centuries, and some of those influences never truly ended. They became part of the system, part of the structure, part of the way the world works today. And that's what makes this realization so powerful, because it changes how you see everything. It forces you to look beyond the surface, beyond the simplified versions, and ask a question that most people never think to ask. What's missing? Because once you start asking that question, you begin to notice things. Small gaps in familiar stories, details that don't quite align, moments that feel too simple for something that should have been complex. And slowly, the past begins to look different. Not wrong, just incomplete. But here's where it becomes unsettling. Because if the past can be shaped, if narratives can be simplified, if entire contributions can be removed without most people ever noticing, then the present becomes harder to trust as well. Because the same patterns don't just disappear. They continue, quietly, consistently, influencing what we see, what we're told, and what we believe. Not in obvious ways, not in ways that can easily be proven or pointed out, but in the structure of information itself, in the boundaries of what feels normal and what doesn't. And once something feels normal, it stops being questioned, and that is where the real power lies. Not in controlling every detail, but in shaping the framework through which people understand those details. Because if you can shape the framework, you don't need to control the story. The story will shape itself. And that's exactly what history has been doing. Not hiding everything, just enough to keep the narrative stable, understandable, acceptable. But beneath that stability, there are layers, unfinished stories, forgotten names, decisions that were never meant to be seen, and systems that continue to carry those decisions forward long after their origins have been forgotten. Which leads to the most important realization of all. History isn't something that ended. It's something we're still living inside. Every system, every structure, every assumption we make about how the world works has roots in the past. And if those roots are incomplete, then our understanding is incomplete too. But that doesn't make history unreliable. It makes it human, complex, layered, and constantly evolving. And maybe that's the real truth that was never taught. Not that history is wrong, but that it's never finished. It's always being shaped, always being interpreted, always being filtered through the perspectives of those who record it. Which means the responsibility doesn't end with what we're taught. It begins with what we question. Because the moment you stop accepting information as complete and start looking for what's missing, you change the way you see everything. You move from passive understanding to active awareness. And that shift is where real knowledge begins. So the next time you hear a story about the past, a familiar event, a well-known name, a version of history that feels certain, pause, look a little deeper, ask yourself, what's not being said? Because sometimes, the most important part of the story is the part you were never told. And once you start seeing that, you realize something that's hard to ignore. The truth was never completely hidden. It was just never fully shown.